Psalm 35. The Lord fights for you. Every enemy is scattered in confusion. Psalm 35 is not a gentle prayer. It is not a quiet meditation whispered in safety. It is a cry from the battlefield of the soul. It is the voice of someone who has been hunted, falsely accused, surrounded by hidden enemies, and pushed into a place where human help has vanished. In this psalm, David does not ask God to merely comfort him. He asks God to rise, to take up shield and spear, to enter the conflict personally. Psalm 35 reveals a truth many believers struggle to accept. There are moments when life is not a lesson, not a test of patience, but a spiritual confrontation. And in those moments, the Lord does not remain distant. He fights. This psalm speaks directly to those who are exhausted from defending themselves, worn down by injustice and confused by attacks that seem undeserved. It speaks to believers who have been betrayed by those they once helped, slandered by voices they never provoked, and targeted without explanation. Psalm 35 declares that God is not neutral when his people are wronged. He does not observe quietly. He intervenes. He confuses the plans of the enemy. He scatters those who plot in darkness. He turns traps back upon those who set them. When the psalmist cries, "Contend, Lord, with those who contend with me, fight against those who fight against me," he reveals a powerful spiritual principle. Some battles are not meant to be fought by human hands. Some conflicts are designed to push the believer into total dependence on divine intervention. Psalm 35 teaches that when you are attacked without cause, when your integrity is questioned, when your peace is stolen, the Lord himself steps forward as your defender. This message is for those who feel surrounded, misunderstood, and targeted. It is for those who have tried to walk uprightly only to be repaid with hostility. It is for those who are tired of explaining themselves and are ready to place their case entirely in God's hands. Psalm 35 reminds us that when the Lord fights for you, your enemies do not simply retreat. They are scattered in confusion. Their strategies collapse, their words lose power, their schemes unravel. Now we enter the first great truth of this psalm. The moment when God steps into the conflict and assumes the role of divine warrior on behalf of his faithful servant. When God enters the battle for you, there is a moment in every believer's life when endurance alone is no longer enough. You have prayed quietly, you have turned the other cheek, you have chosen silence over retaliation, you have entrusted your reputation to God. Yet the attacks continue, the accusations multiply, the pressure increases. Psalm 35 reveals what happens at that moment. God does not ask you to fight harder. He steps into the fight himself. The opening verses of Psalm 35 are startling in their intensity. David calls on God to contend with those who contend with him. This is legal language, courtroom language, battlefield language, all at once. It reveals that the conflict David is facing is not merely emotional or social, it is spiritual and existential. His enemies are not seeking correction or resolution, they are seeking destruction. And when destruction becomes the goal of the adversary, God does not remain passive. One of the greatest misconceptions among believers is the idea that God's silence means indifference. Psalm 35 shatters that illusion. Silence is not absence. Delay is not abandonment. Often God allows a conflict to mature until it exposes the true intentions of those involved. When the enemy's heart is fully revealed, God acts decisively. He does not act prematurely, and he does not act weakly. When God enters the battle, the nature of the conflict changes completely. What was once a human struggle becomes a divine confrontation. The psalmist does not ask for personal strength to overpower his enemies. He asks God to take up shield and buckler, to draw the spear, to block the path of those pursuing him. This imagery communicates total divine engagement. God does not merely advise from heaven, he positions himself between the believer and the threat. This is a critical spiritual truth. When God fights for you, your enemies are no longer fighting you, they are fighting Him. And no one fights God and emerges victorious. The confusion that scatters the enemy does not come from chaos. It comes from divine intervention. Their plans fail not because they are weak, but because God disrupts their clarity. He dismantles their coordination. He turns their confidence into uncertainty. Psalm 35 teaches that enemies often rely on secrecy and falsehood. They whisper accusations, they distort facts, they manipulate narratives. But when God enters the battle, truth becomes unavoidable. Light exposes motives. Hidden agendas surface. Lies collapse under their own weight. The enemy finds themselves unable to explain their actions, unable to justify their hatred, unable to sustain their deception. Another powerful dimension of this psalm is the reversal principle. David describes how his enemies dig pits and set traps without cause. Yet he prays that those very traps would ensnare the ones who set them. This is not vengeance driven by bitterness. It is justice administered by God. The Lord does not invent punishment. He allows the enemy's own intentions to become their downfall. This is why the scattering is so complete. The enemy is undone by their own devices. When God fights for you, He also addresses the emotional toll of the battle. David is not detached or unaffected. He speaks of his soul being overwhelmed, his strength failing, his spirit burdened, yet he places all of this before God. Psalm 35 shows that divine warfare is not cold or mechanical. It is personal. God defends not only your position, but your peace. He restores not only justice, but dignity. There is also a profound lesson here about restraint. David does not take justice into his own hands. He does not gather allies to retaliate. He does not launch a counterattack. Instead, he prays. This is not weakness. It is spiritual authority. Those who truly trust God understand that divine intervention accomplishes what human reaction never can. Retaliation escalates conflict. Surrender invites resolution. When the Lord fights for you, your role is not to strategize revenge, but to remain faithful. Psalm 35 reveals that God's intervention is triggered by integrity. David repeatedly emphasizes that the attacks against him are without cause. This does not mean he is perfect. It means he is sincere. God defends those who walk uprightly, not those who manipulate righteousness for personal gain. The scattering of the enemy is not always immediate, but it is inevitable. Confusion enters their camp. Unity fractures. Confidence erodes. What once seemed like a coordinated assault becomes disorganized noise. This is how God fights, quietly, thoroughly, decisively. He does not need spectacle. He needs only time and truth. For the believer listening today, Psalm 35 offers assurance. You are not abandoned in your struggle. If you are being attacked without cause, misunderstood despite sincerity, and pressured beyond endurance, know this: God sees. And when He chooses to act, the battle will shift in ways you could never orchestrate yourself. Your responsibility is not to force the outcome, but to trust the defender. Stay faithful, stay aligned, stay silent when necessary. The Lord knows how to fight for His own, and when He does, every enemy is scattered in confusion. If this message is strengthening your faith and reminding you that God is your defender, take a moment now to subscribe to the channel. By subscribing, you join a community committed to biblical truth, spiritual strength, and unwavering trust in the Lord who fights for His people. When the enemy's schemes turn against themselves, Psalm 35 reveals a pattern that appears repeatedly throughout Scripture and throughout the lived experience of faithful believers. Those who rise against the righteous without cause eventually become trapped by their own intentions. This is not poetic exaggeration. It is a spiritual law woven into the moral structure of reality. When the psalmist cries out for God to intervene, he does not ask the Lord to invent new punishments or create arbitrary suffering for his enemies. Instead, He asks that what they have secretly planned would return upon their own heads. This distinction is crucial because it reveals the nature of divine justice. God does not operate from impulse or anger. He allows truth to complete its course. There is something deeply unsettling to the human mind about hidden hostility. Open opposition can be faced, confronted, and processed. But secret malice, smiles that conceal intent, words that flatter while planning harm, creates a different kind of burden. Psalm 35 speaks directly to this experience. David describes enemies who pursue him relentlessly, who dig pits without cause, who repay good with evil, and who rejoice in his stumbling. These are not adversaries engaged in honest disagreement. They are individuals consumed by resentment, envy, or bitterness, operating in secrecy. When such enemies act, they believe their concealment protects them. They assume their plans are invisible. They trust that time, manipulation, and repetition will wear down the righteous. But Psalm 35 exposes a reality they do not consider. Nothing hidden remains hidden before God. The very secrecy they depend on becomes the instrument of their downfall. Their confidence blinds them. Their certainty that no one sees allows their intentions to deepen until they can no longer escape them. One of the most powerful lines in Psalm 35 is the prayer that the enemy would fall into the pit they themselves have dug. This is not cruelty, it is revelation. A pit represents preparation, patience, and persistence. You do not dig a pit casually. You dig it with purpose, believing someone will fall into it. The psalmist understands that when a person invests themselves fully in malice, they align their own fate with that malice. When God allows the trap to reverse, He is not changing the rules. He is allowing the rules to be revealed. This reversal is often slow, which is why many believers struggle during the waiting period. It can feel unbearable to watch injustice persist. It can feel humiliating to endure false accusations without immediate vindication. But Psalm 35 teaches that delay does not favor the enemy. It exposes them. The longer a scheme operates, the more elaborate it becomes, and the more tightly the schemer binds themselves to it. When the collapse comes, it is not partial, it is complete. The confusion that scatters the enemy is not random. It is the unraveling of coherence. Lies require constant reinforcement. Deception depends on memory, consistency, and control. When God intervenes, He introduces truth into a system built on falsehood. The result is confusion. Stories no longer align, alliances fracture, motives are questioned. The enemy begins to contradict themselves, to turn on one another, to lose the clarity that once made their plans effective. This is why Scripture so often warns against plotting evil in secret. It is not merely a moral warning, it is a practical one. Evil is unstable. It cannot sustain itself indefinitely. Psalm 35 reveals that God does not need to expose every detail of the enemy's plans publicly. Sometimes He simply removes the clarity that made those plans possible. Without clarity, coordination fails. Without coordination, power dissolves. For the believer under attack, this truth offers profound relief. You do not need to uncover every lie spoken about you. You do not need to confront every whisper or defend against every accusation. Psalm 35 shows that God handles exposure more effectively than any human effort. When He acts, He does not argue with lies. He renders them incoherent. He allows the enemy to reveal themselves through their own words and actions. Another dimension of this reversal is emotional. Those who scheme against the righteous often derive a sense of satisfaction from perceived control. They feel powerful when they believe they can influence outcomes unseen. But when their plans fail, that sense of control collapses. Fear replaces confidence. Anxiety replaces arrogance. The very emotions they sought to impose on the believer return to them magnified. David's prayer reflects an understanding of this emotional reversal. He does not ask merely for physical deliverance. He asks that his enemies be put to shame and dishonor. Shame, in biblical terms, is not humiliation for its own sake. It is the recognition that one's actions have been exposed as unjust. It is the moment when the inner and outer selves can no longer be separated. God allows the enemy to see themselves clearly, often for the first time. This is why Psalm 35 is not a psalm of revenge, but of restoration. When evil collapses under its own weight, space is created for healing. The believer is freed from constant defense. Peace begins to return. Confidence in God is renewed. The enemy, scattered and confused, loses influence. What once felt overwhelming becomes distant. There is also a warning embedded in this psalm for anyone tempted to respond to injustice with similar tactics. Psalm 35 makes it clear that digging pits is not neutral behavior. It shapes the soul of the one who digs. Even when directed at someone perceived as an enemy, hidden malice corrodes the heart. God's justice ensures that no one benefits spiritually from deception. Those who choose integrity may suffer temporarily, but they remain whole. Those who choose manipulation may succeed briefly, but they fracture internally. For the believer listening, this topic invites patience. It calls for restraint rooted in trust. It assures you that God is not unaware of what is happening behind closed doors, whispered in private, or planned in secret. Every word spoken without cause, every plot devised in darkness, every intention shaped by malice is known. And when the time is right, God allows those intentions to return to their source. This does not always happen in dramatic public moments. Sometimes it unfolds quietly. Relationships dissolve, credibility erodes, opportunities disappear. The enemy may not even understand why their influence is fading, but the scattering is real. The confusion is complete. The pit remains, and the one who dug it can no longer avoid it. As you continue to trust God in your own battles, remember this truth from Psalm 35. You do not need to fear hidden enemies. Hidden plans cannot stand before an all-seeing God. What is done in darkness does not gain strength there. It loses it. The light does not need to chase the dark. It only needs to appear. If this teaching is helping you remain steady, patient, and faithful while God works on your behalf, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. By subscribing, you become part of a community committed to biblical wisdom, spiritual endurance, and trusting the Lord to bring justice in His perfect time. When silence becomes your strongest weapon. Psalm 35 unveils a truth that feels counterintuitive to human instinct. There are seasons when the most powerful response to injustice is not explanation, not defense, not confrontation, but silence anchored in trust. This silence is not fear. It is not weakness. It is not avoidance. It is spiritual positioning. It is the deliberate choice to step out of the noise of accusation and place your case entirely in the hands of God. David's experience in Psalm 35 reveals that when the righteous are attacked without cause, words often become unnecessary, and silence becomes a shield. Human nature demands self-justification. When falsely accused, the immediate impulse is to correct the narrative, defend the reputation, and expose the lie. Yet Psalm 35 presents a deeper wisdom. David does not list every accusation against him. He does not record detailed rebuttals. Instead, he brings the matter before God and allows divine justice to speak where human explanation would only prolong the conflict. This is not passivity, it is discernment. Silence, when rooted in faith, removes fuel from the fire of malice. Those who scheme against the righteous often rely on reaction. They provoke in order to observe responses. They accuse in order to extract explanations that can later be twisted. They attack, hoping to draw the believer into emotional entanglement. Psalm 35 shows that when the righteous refuse to engage on the enemy's terms, the strategy begins to collapse. The enemy cannot control what they cannot provoke. David describes enemies who repay good with evil, who accuse him without cause, who rejoice in his suffering. These individuals are not seeking truth, they are seeking dominance. Engaging such people rarely leads to resolution. Silence, however, frustrates their intent. When there is no reaction to manipulate, the schemer loses leverage. Confusion enters. Frustration grows. The enemy begins to expose themselves through increasingly erratic behavior. There is also a spiritual dimension to this silence. When a believer remains quiet before God, they create space for divine intervention. Noise fills the soul with urgency. Silence creates room for discernment. Psalm 35 demonstrates that David's confidence was not in his ability to persuade others of his innocence, but in God's ability to reveal the truth at the right time. Silence becomes an act of faith because it declares without words, God sees what I do not need to explain. This kind of silence is deeply uncomfortable. It requires restraint when the heart wants release. It requires trust when the mind demands resolution. But Psalm 35 assures the believer that God does not require constant explanation in order to act. He is not convinced by arguments. He is moved by integrity. The righteous do not need to narrate their pain endlessly for God to understand it. He already knows. Another powerful aspect of silence in Psalm 35 is how it protects the inner life of the believer. Constant defense drains emotional and spiritual energy. It pulls the soul into a posture of reaction rather than alignment. Silence preserves strength. It allows the believer to remain grounded while God handles what they cannot control. David's focus remains on God, not on his enemies. This orientation is what sustains him. Silence also reveals character. When falsely accused, those who are innocent often feel compelled to prove it. But Psalm 35 reveals that character does not require advertisement. Over time, consistency speaks louder than defense. When the believer continues to walk uprightly, the contrast between truth and falsehood becomes unmistakable. God uses time as an instrument of revelation. Silence allows time to do its work. There is a profound reversal here. The enemy speaks constantly, spreads narratives, repeats accusations. The righteous remain quiet, steady, faithful. Eventually, the imbalance becomes obvious. Observers begin to question the aggressor. Why so much noise? Why so much insistence? Why such intensity if the accusation is true? Silence does not hide the truth, it highlights it. Psalm 35 also shows that silence does not mean the believer is unaffected. David expresses anguish, sorrow, and distress directly to God. Silence before people does not mean silence before heaven. This distinction is crucial. The believer is not suppressing pain, they are redirecting it. Instead of pouring words into hostile ears, they pour their heart out to God. This preserves dignity and invites divine comfort. In many battles, the temptation to speak comes from fear of misunderstanding. But Psalm 35 reminds us that being misunderstood by people does not mean being misjudged by God. Divine judgment carries eternal weight, human opinion does not. Silence reflects confidence in the judge who sees rightly. It declares that the believer values God's verdict more than public approval. This silence also disarms retaliation. When attacked, the flesh seeks revenge disguised as justice. Psalm 35 refuses that path. David does not curse his enemies from a place of personal hatred. He entrusts judgment to God. Silence prevents the believer from crossing the line where righteous suffering turns into unrighteous response. It protects the soul from becoming what it opposes. There are moments when God calls his people to speak boldly. Scripture affirms that. But Psalm 35 reveals that there are also moments when silence is the higher obedience. Discernment lies in knowing the difference. When speaking would entangle you further in the enemy's scheme, silence is wisdom. When explaining would compromise peace, silence is protection. When defending would distract from God's work, silence is faith. As God fights for the believer, silence becomes a witness. It testifies that trust is not theoretical but lived. It declares that the believer believes God will act, not someday, but in his perfect time. This silence does not delay justice, it invites it. God does not require noise to intervene, he requires faith. For those listening who feel the weight of false accusation, misrepresentation, or silent hostility, Psalm 35 offers permission to rest. You do not need to chase every rumor. You do not need to confront every lie. You do not need to defend your name at the cost of your peace. God is capable of handling what you release to him. Silence does not mean you have lost. Often, it means the battle has shifted into God's hands. And when God fights, he does not need your words. He needs your trust. The scattering of the enemy often begins the moment the believer stops striving and starts resting in divine justice. If this message is helping you understand the power of trusting God in silence and allowing him to defend you, take a moment now to subscribe to the channel. By subscribing, you support content that strengthens faith, deepens biblical understanding, and reminds believers that when the Lord fights for you, no accusation can stand and no enemy can prevail. When God restores your soul after the battle, Psalm 35 does not end with survival alone. It moves beyond deliverance into restoration. This is one of the most overlooked truths in spiritual warfare. God does not merely remove the threat. He heals the damage left behind. Many believers endure attacks, accusations, betrayals, and prolonged opposition. Yet once the conflict subsides, they are left exhausted, guarded, and inwardly wounded. Psalm 35 reveals that when the Lord fights for you, his work does not conclude with the scattering of enemies. It continues with the renewal of the soul. Spiritual battles are not abstract experiences. They affect the inner life deeply. False accusations create anxiety. Prolonged injustice erodes trust. Being targeted without cause produces confusion and self-doubt. Even when a believer remains faithful, the strain accumulates. David does not deny this reality. Throughout Psalm 35, his language reflects emotional fatigue, sorrow, and deep distress. Yet he does not accept these wounds as permanent. He brings them before God with the same confidence he brings his enemies. One of the most powerful aspects of Psalm 35 is David's insistence that God sees not only the injustice, but its impact. He speaks of his soul being bowed down, of strength failing, of being surrounded by mockery. This honesty is essential. Restoration begins where denial ends. God does not restore what we pretend was never harmed. He restores what is surrendered honestly into his care. When God fights for you, he also takes responsibility for your recovery. This is a profound spiritual truth. Many believers unknowingly try to heal themselves through distraction, busyness, or emotional withdrawal. Psalm 35 offers a different path, healing through divine justice and divine presence. David does not seek personal closure through confrontation. He seeks wholeness through God's intervention. Restoration in this psalm is not immediate relief, but gradual reordering. As the enemy is scattered, the believer's inner world begins to realign. Fear loses authority, shame dissolves, confidence returns, not as arrogance, but as peace. David anticipates this restoration even before it fully manifests. He speaks of rejoicing in the Lord, of praise returning to his mouth, of his soul being satisfied again. Faith sees healing before it feels it. Another critical dimension of restoration in Psalm 35 is dignity. Attacks without cause often strip dignity from the righteous. Being misrepresented, falsely judged, or publicly undermined can make a believer feel reduced, unseen, or humiliated. God's restoration addresses this directly. David asks not only for deliverance but for vindication. Vindication is not about ego, it is about truth being honored. When God restores dignity, He does not inflate the self. He re-establishes alignment between truth and perception. This restoration also recalibrates the believer's understanding of trust. After betrayal or prolonged hostility, the heart often becomes guarded. Psalm 35 does not suggest naive openness, but it does point toward renewed trust in God. David does not emerge from the battle cynical or hardened. He emerges anchored more deeply in divine faithfulness. This is a crucial distinction. God's restoration does not make the believer reckless. It makes them resilient. There is also a communal dimension to this restoration. David speaks of praising God in the great assembly. This reveals that restoration is not meant to remain private. God restores the believer not only for their own peace, but as a testimony to others. When someone who has been attacked unjustly stands restored, steady and faithful, it speaks powerfully. It declares that God's justice is not theoretical, it is active and personal. Psalm 35 also reveals that restoration includes clarity. During conflict, perspective narrows. Everything feels urgent. Everything feels personal. After God intervenes, clarity returns. The believer can see what truly mattered and what did not. The noise fades. The lessons remain. David does not obsess over his enemies after the battle. His focus shifts back to God. Restoration re-centers the soul on its true source. This clarity protects the believer from repeating unhealthy patterns. Without restoration, unresolved pain can shape future reactions. Psalm 35 prevents this by placing healing within God's justice. David does not carry unresolved resentment forward. He leaves judgment where it belongs. This allows him to move forward without bitterness. Restoration is incomplete if peace exists externally, but turmoil remains internally. God addresses both. Another often missed aspect of restoration is strength, not the strength of aggression, but the strength of endurance. Having survived unjust opposition, the believer emerges with deeper spiritual maturity. Psalm 35 shows that God does not waste suffering. The battle becomes part of the believer's testimony, not their identity. It refines discernment, deepens humility, and strengthens reliance on God. This restoration also renews joy. Joy after battle is different from joy before it. It is quieter, deeper, more stable. David's anticipated praise is not shallow celebration. It is grounded gratitude. He knows what it means to be defended by God. That knowledge reshapes worship. Praise becomes informed by experience, not assumption. For the believer listening today who feels drained by ongoing conflict or who has emerged from a battle still carrying invisible wounds, Psalm 35 offers hope. God does not expect you to simply move on. He invites you to be restored. He sees the fatigue others do not see. He understands the vigilance that lingers even after danger passes. His restoration is not rushed, but it is complete. You are not meant to survive spiritual warfare and remain diminished. God restores peace, clarity, joy, and strength. He heals what was strained. He rebuilds what was shaken. When the Lord fights for you, He also walks with you afterward, ensuring that the battle does not define your future. If this message is helping you understand that God not only defends you but also restores your soul after the battle, take a moment now to subscribe to the channel. By subscribing, you join a community dedicated to biblical truth, spiritual healing, and trusting the Lord, who brings justice, renewal, and peace to His people. When praise rises from victory and your faith is sealed, Psalm 35 reaches its deepest fulfillment not in the scattering of enemies alone, nor even in the quiet restoration of the wounded soul, but in the moment when praise rises naturally from lived victory. This praise is not forced optimism. It is not denial of pain. It is not religious performance. It is the sound of a faith that has passed through fire and emerged intact. When God fights for you and brings you through the battle, praise becomes inevitable. Not because everything was easy, but because everything was handled by Him. One of the most powerful truths revealed in Psalm 35 is that praise does not wait for perfection of circumstances. It rises from the certainty of divine justice. David speaks of rejoicing in the Lord, of his soul being glad in God's salvation, even while recounting betrayal, mockery, and prolonged opposition. This reveals a mature faith, one that understands that victory is not defined by the absence of struggle, but by the presence of God within it. Praise after battle is different from praise before it. Before the battle, praise is often rooted in hope. After the battle, praise is rooted in memory. David praises because he has seen what God does when enemies rise without cause. He has witnessed confusion scatter those who plotted in secret. He has experienced divine defense where human strength would have failed. This kind of praise carries authority. It is not theoretical worship. It is testimony. Psalm 35 shows that praise becomes a declaration of alignment. When the believer praises God after victory, they are affirming that the outcome did not come from their own effort. They are sealing the truth that God alone was their defender. This is spiritually significant. It prevents pride from taking root. It ensures that gratitude, not self-congratulation, defines the aftermath. Praise keeps the heart humble and the memory accurate. Another crucial dimension of praise in Psalm 35 is public acknowledgement. David speaks of praising God in the great assembly. This is not for spectacle, it is for witness. When God fights for His people, the result is not meant to remain hidden. Praise becomes a way of testifying that righteousness is not abandoned, that integrity is not foolish, and that trusting God is not in vain. The believer's praise becomes a signpost for others who are still in the middle of their own battles. Praise also completes the cycle of justice. Without praise, victory can feel unfinished. The enemy may be scattered, but the soul may remain cautious, guarded, or emotionally unfinished. Praise releases what remains. It allows the believer to let go of vigilance and return fully to trust. It shifts the heart from survival mode back into worship. This is not a small transition. It is essential for spiritual health. Psalm 35 reveals that praise realigns the believer's identity. During prolonged conflict, it is easy to become defined by opposition, by what was done to you, by what was taken from you, by what you had to endure. Praise breaks that identification. It reminds the believer who they are and whose they are. David's joy is not rooted in the humiliation of his enemies, but in the faithfulness of his God. This distinction matters deeply. There is also a protective power in praise. After victory, there is a temptation to replay the battle endlessly, to revisit the injustice, to rehearse what could have been said or done differently. Praise interrupts that loop. It redirects attention away from the enemy and back to God. It prevents the mind from becoming a battlefield long after the external conflict has ended. Praise guards the peace that God restored. Another often overlooked truth in Psalm 35 is that praise strengthens future faith. When the believer praises God after victory, they are storing memory. They are building an internal archive of God's faithfulness. This archive becomes vital in future trials. When the next challenge arises, praise reminds the soul, God fought for me before, and He will do it again. Praise turns past deliverance into future confidence. David's praise is also rooted in gratitude for justice, not revenge. He does not celebrate destruction for its own sake. He celebrates the fact that truth prevailed, that falsehood failed, and that God did not allow injustice to have the final word. This protects the believer from becoming hardened or vindictive. Praise keeps the heart soft while affirming strength. Psalm 35 also teaches that praise is an act of closure. Closure does not come from confrontation or explanation. It comes from surrender. When the believer praises God, they are releasing the battle fully into His hands, past, present, and future. They are saying without words, "This chapter belongs to you." That release is what allows the believer to move forward without carrying unnecessary weight. For those who have walked through prolonged opposition, praise may initially feel distant or unfamiliar. Psalm 35 does not demand instant joy. It invites honest worship. David's praise is layered with memory, pain, and relief. It is real. It is earned. God does not reject praise that carries scars. In fact, that praise is often the most powerful. Praise also restores perspective. It reminds the believer that no enemy is ultimate, no accusation is final, and no injustice escapes God's attention. When praise rises, fear diminishes. Confidence in God expands. The believer no longer sees themselves as vulnerable prey but as protected children. This shift in self-perception is essential for walking forward with courage. Finally, Psalm 35 reveals that praise honors God in a way nothing else can after victory. Prayer invites Him into the battle. Trust sustains the believer during it. Praise acknowledges Him after it. This full cycle completes the relationship. God is not only the defender, but the deliverer. Praise affirms that relationship openly and sincerely. For the believer listening now, this final truth is clear. When the Lord fights for you, the story does not end in silence or suspicion. It ends in praise, not shallow praise, but grounded worship, not loud celebration, but deep gratitude. Praise seals the victory. It anchors faith, it restores joy, and it prepares the soul for whatever comes next. If this message has strengthened your faith and reminded you that God not only defends you, but brings you into victory and praise, take a moment now to subscribe to the channel. By subscribing, you become part of a community devoted to biblical truth, enduring faith and trusting the Lord who fights for His people and leads them from battle into peace.